Hello and welcome to the IND podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Before we begin today, I want to remind you to subscribe to our channel to stay in the loop. Let's get right into our main story today, which is an update on the coup and situation in Sudan. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to quickly cover some updates and things that have happened and concurred and occurred after the situation on Monday. We're going to do an analysis on the potential future of Sudan and how this entire situation could potentially play out. And we're primarily going to do this by focusing on one individual, General Abdel-Fattah Burhan, which is the head of the military that initiated this coup on Monday and is now the de facto head of state of Sudan. Now, to just give you a very quick update on what we reported on 2 days ago. This Monday, Al-Burhan led the military to dissolve the civilian portion of the government of Sudan. Now, Sudan was being run by a transitionary government, which was split between military control and civilian politicians. Now, Al-Burhan moved in and removed these civilian politicians, notably arresting Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok and a significant other portion of high-ranking government civilian officials. Now, in the meantime, Abdallah Hamdok has been released. The former Prime Minister of Sudan has been released and he is no longer under military detention, though a significant other portion of civilian government officials are still held under military detention. But let's now look at how the situation is actually developing and the future of what could potentially happen. General Burhan has stated that he intends to continue the democratic transition of Sudan, stating that he wants to hold elections on July of 2023. However, this is actually suspicious. When looking at the dynamics of the situation, the regional superpowers that have influence on what's going on in Sudan, Burhan's history, connections, the military in general, and other actors that are in play, this actually seems extremely unlikely. Now, the first thing that makes Burhan's statement that he wants to transition to a democracy seem untrue is that the sovereign council that was ruling Sudan up until this point was split between 5 military officials and 5 civilian officials. But it had one head, one director, which was Burhan himself. General Fattah al-Burhan was the de facto head of state and the most powerful person in Sudan this entire time. But within a few weeks from Monday, it was intended for him to be replaced by a civilian. And this can actually be viewed as the main instigator and catalyst of the coup, the main reason that this was carried out. Now, to further understand why this democratic transition or promise of a transition seems suspicious, we have to look at Burhan's connections, Burhan's history, and exactly what the military has to lose. So let's start with a little bit of history and the resume of General Abdel-Fattah Burhan. Al-Burhan studied at the Military College of Egypt. During this time, he made a lot of connections with the Egyptian military, which is an extremely influential and important ally to have in Sudan. Keep a note that Sudan used to be a colony of the United Kingdom and it was ruled by Egypt in the name of the UK before its independence in 1956. Egypt is right north of Sudan and has a major military that can be used as an ally in case anything happens. Burhan has extremely strong ties with current Egyptian president and former general Al-Sisi. Now, in addition to his connections to Egyptian president, Burhan also has extremely strong ties with Gulf Coast leaders who are very influential, not just globally, but superpowers in the region, hegemonic superpowers in the region, having very close ties to Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Now, he built these ties by leading and sending Sudanese military troops to help the Saudi-backed coalition fight Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen. Now, we're not going to go into the conflict of Yemen, but it is basically a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are vying for control to be regional superpowers of the region. But anyways, while sending these troops, he created a stronger relationship with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So Burhan is a very powerful man with very powerful friends. And what this means is that unlike his predecessor, General Omar al-Bashir, who is internationally viewed as a war criminal, a monster, completely a pariah, and was facing sanction after sanction, Burhan is not going to have the same level of pressure. So he's going to have more free reign to do what he wants to do, not being forced to answer to a democratic population in an election, and not being forced by the international community telling him what to do. So that's just one of the things that are at play here. What else needs to be understood is Burhan's history. Now, Burhan's history actually makes it seem like he has the intention of having a democratic transition, or at the very least, he is significantly more moderate and progressive than other generals and other leaders in Sudan's past. Now, Burhan has been one of the head generals in Sudan's military since the conflicts in Darfur, and he partook in these conflicts. But unlike many generals, and unlike the former dictator of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, Burhan has never been indicted, investigated, or accused of war crimes. Now, keep in mind, Darfur is one of the darkest and most horrible, horrific, terrifying moments in modern African history. Over 300,000 people were killed and 2.7 million people were displaced. A lot of people lost their lives and livelihoods. A lot of war crimes and atrocities occurred during this time. And Burhan came out with his hands clean. That's a big deal. In addition to that, unlike the rest of the military generals that are in Sudan, Burhan is not an Islamist. He is still a Muslim, but his political ideology is not based in Islam. And the Islamist military ideology is what has been leading and controlling this dictatorship that has been existing in Sudan for over 30 years. Now, when he doesn't have this ideology, it makes it seem more likely that he's actually fine with putting civilians in control or having a democratic transition. In addition to this, in 2019, when the coup that replaced Omar al-Bashir with the Sovereign Council occurred, Burhan was ordered by Bashir to violently remove protesters. Instead of doing so, he sat down with these protesters and spoke to them and listened to their concerns. And keep in mind, while he did do this, behind the scenes, generals and allies in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates were telling him, get Bashir out of there, kick him out, overthrow him. The Gulf Coast community did not want Bashir. He was simply problematic, both for Africa and the Arab world. They wanted him gone, and removed he was. Now, despite sitting down with the protesters and stating that he was willing to listen to their interests and stating that he's actually open to democracy, after Burhan took power from Omar al-Bashir, he refused to give or create a civilian council, and protests would continue for months. Now, the military reacted very violently to this. And one other actor, one other individual has to be mentioned here. Mohammed Hemedti, he's commonly known as Hemedti, the general and commander of the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. Now, the Rapid Support Forces are a militia. They are not an official government entity of Sudan or a part of the Sudanese military, but they frequently work with and always fight alongside the Sudanese military since the war in Darfur. Now, Hemedti, who is considered to be one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful person in Sudan, was given the green light by Burhan to send RSF soldiers along with Sudanese military forces to remove protesters. And in this removal, over 100 people were killed and dozens of women were raped. This was atrocious. And while Burhan managed to distance himself from the war crimes that occurred in the conflict in Darfur, which he partook in, his hands got dirty on that day in 2019. Now, international pressure would eventually push Burhan and other military leaders to create the Civilian Sovereign Council and create a plan for democratic trajectory. Now, that Civilian Council, as we've seen on Monday, hasn't lasted. It no longer exists. And the military is in full control. And Burhan has stated that he wants to continue this transition. But let's actually look at the reality of the situation. Why would he? The military and Burhan himself have a lot of things to lose here. Even if Burhan individually wants, actually deeply in his heart, wants and intends a democratic transition, there are countless of other military actors, primarily Mohammed Hamedi, the commander of the RSF, that do not want this. Now keep in mind, a lot of these military officials, and Hamedi, who is the head of the paramilitary RSF, have become extremely wealthy over the past 20 to 30 years. These military generals are millionaires. Hamedi is actually one of the richest, if not the wealthiest person in Sudan, having companies that deal in oil trade, metal production, car rentals, you name it. He does everything, and he is one of the wealthiest, most powerful people in Sudan. A lot of other military generals are like this. They have a lot of financial resources that have virtually been stolen from Sudan. They would most likely lose these financial resources if a civilian government was to be put in power. In addition to this, why would someone willingly give up full and absolute political dominance? It's just not in the military's interest. Now, finally, probably the major reason that not a single military official, including Burhan himself, would give power over to a civilian government is because of war crimes. Many of these generals, many of these paramilitary individuals, General Hamedi himself has openly admitted to the African Union for being responsible for war crimes that occurred in Darfur, have a lot to lose. If a civilian government comes in place, these generals can be put on trial in Sudan, or even worse, be given to the International Criminal Court to be investigated, tried, and have their day in court and eventually be put in jail for the crimes that they committed during these wars. And that just shows that they have no interest. There's no vested interest. Despite what they're saying, the true motives show that transitioning to a democratic civilian government would almost be suicide without a major amount of guarantees. So even if Burhan wants democracy, there are hundreds of generals standing behind him, supporting him, that do not want it. And there is one extremely powerful individual, Hamedi, who certainly does not want it. A man who is brutal, who is feared, and who is extremely powerful. Now, the last and probably largest reason that Sudan is not going to have a democratic transition, and if it does, it's going to be extremely long fought, and it's definitely not going to occur in 2023, and it's not going to be easy, is that Sudan is heavily influenced by neighboring Arab and African countries and regional superpowers, primarily Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Egypt. Now, these countries, and I'm mostly talking about Saudi Arabia and the UAE here. Egypt has some form of democracy, but it's not real democracy. It's still a military government in reality, despite how it wants to act. These governments do not want a successful Arab Spring. In Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for example, the people live under what is a dictatorship. They do not have full democratic freedoms. And if these people are able to see that another country with Arabs, another Arab country, is able, through protest and demonstration, through constant pushing, fight for democracy, successfully fight for democracy, they might try to do this at home themselves. Now, do keep in mind, and I want to state that I'm not criticizing the governments of Saudi Arabia or the UAE for being undemocratic, okay? Democracy is not always the best solution. That's just a fundamental economic and political reality when looking at the world in a whole perspective. Not every country can work under a Western democratic system. Some of the best countries to live in today are Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And the rulers of Saudi Arabia and the UAE feel that it's in the people's best interest for their countries to remain under autocratic rule. And those people feel the same way. But if this sliver or shiver of democracy can be seen to happen in another country that has 44 million people to successfully be carried out against a military that is all powerful, anything can happen in the Gulf, and it could destabilize the region. Now, finally, the rest of the international community is probably not going to get involved. And I'm looking at the United States when I talk about this. The US tends to get involved when it wants to spread democracy around the world. It used to. It doesn't want to anymore. It's shown that these attempts typically fail. Now, the United States is probably going to try and carry out economic incentives or disincentives, maybe eventually sanctions to try and push for this transition, but they're most likely not going to be successful. I'm going to end the report by saying this. Sudan may eventually transition to a full democracy, but it's highly unlikely. There are a lot of dynamics and factors at play and a lot of people with a lot to lose if that happens. But let me know what you think. Comment how you feel the situation is going to play out and what you think the future of Sudan is going to look like. See you next time.